Today, I'm joined by none other than Curtis Yarvin, aka Mencius Moldbug, the Mac Daddy of esoteric posters, an blogger who is a great inspiration to a lot of people in my circles, and I'm really excited to have you on today, Curtis.
Thank you. Pleasure to join you. And you're recording from where was it? It was Xinjiang or Ghana or something like that.
It's Transylvania, land of ill
Transylvania.
repute. Yeah,
All right, all right, all right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Old Sax. Are you in one of those old Saxon towns? With
that's
the walls and
very well cited. I'm not in one of those towns. I'm in one of these a bit of Austro-Hungarian towns on the border. But
oh, nice.
I'm that's my lineage. My dad is from that part, from one of those enclaves, where he only
Got
spoke
it.
German until he was, I don't know, he had to go to communist school or something.
And
So
somehow they survived the war because there was a lot of ethnic cleansing around there after World War II, I believe.
I mean, they survived or migrated or, just skipped town before anyone
Yeah.
could get them. That's one strategy. Yeah, my dad just, he kind of he played it cool. He had a strange sounding name. That's my name. So no one really knew what was going on with him. He could have been, Serbian, Slovak or something. So
Right,
he
right,
didn't play up
right,
his
right,
ethnicity, but it
right,
was, yeah,
right.
it was pretty chill. He made it out all right from both communism and any ethnic cleansing that he was subjected to.
Gotcha,
Um,
gotcha.
so today, as a lot of people who have been on my Twitter have seen, there's a lot of questions. There are many questions, and I want to
Oh,
structure
oh,
this
I'm
in,
I'm being
in many.
interrogated. This is a real
Yes,
Eastern European interrogation here. Oh my God. All right,
this is a
fine.
format. This is a format. So there are long sprawling questions where we can play, and then there is a kind of quick fire round, just so I can get yes and nos, and kind of fulfill people's curiosity about some things that include quite random things. So I think it's going to be fun. I promise.
Yes, I don't promise to answer all questions, but I may deflect some. But I'll try to tell the truth. So help me, my iPhone. All right, shoot. Let's go.
Perfect. Cool. So the first question, my question, is how close are we? We know what time is it now in the cycle of our regime, and how close are we to this regime imploding and a counter elite rising? What's
I, I I think that's very hard to know. I think that it's really better to think in terms of decades than years, because even if it's not decades, that would come as a sort of small miracle, and that would be surprising in the same way that the fall of the Soviet Union was surprising. But what I see is, the reason I'm sort of so I don't know, I would call black pilled on that, but I sort of want to kind of dampen people's hopes and kind of dreams on this subject, even in a way, is that whenever you discover sort of something new and you sort of realize, hey, here's this different way of seeing the world that I've just found, and it's a new way of seeing the world for you. And so from your perspective, the world is changing very rapidly because your own perspective is changing. Right. And so you go from, wow, I was in this kind of normie world to, I've been flushed down the giant tube, and I'm now in the Morpheus's spaceship. Right. And you're just like, you expect things to keep happening. And the reality is, those dudes have been out there in that spaceship for a long time. Right. And, and especially it's like, and so from the expectation that that kind of change is rapid proceeds a sort of a whole you can make a whole different set of errors that come out of that, and those errors become strategic errors, they become tactical errors, they become historical errors. It's like when you look at, let's say a lot of the, people who would call themselves, anti-woke now in the like, around the like Quillette IDW circles. I was talking with James Lindsay for a while at this conference we were at. Perfectly fine guy, but the thing is, it's sort of necessary in this historiography that because the problem can be solved soon, it must be easy to solve. Because it's easy to solve, it must be superficial. And so you sort of go after these kinds of superficial targets, or you feel somehow, this leads you to certain strands in the Gordian knot, which you feel can be untied and untied relatively simply. And so you just go down the wrong path when you expect these things to be easy. Moreover, you sort of go down the path of thinking much more offensively than you should, and the reality is that sort of under any regime to exist is entirely sufficient. And to exist is sort of what you're looking for, and you become overly confrontational. And I really, if there's anything I've learned, in the past 10 years, it's that being confrontational is even worse than I thought. And
Is this
so
direct reflection on James Lindsay's
well,
recent?
no, 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 no. People. I mean, that's in some ways a different kind of confrontationalness, but yeah, no, no. I don't like people can have flame wars on Twitter. That's fine. It's more like when you sort of one of the things. Let me expand on that. This is probably going to answer. Hopefully, if I digress and answer a question you have later, you can just skip that question, and so you won't have to interrogate me twice, compare the
I love how
answers.
you're already reading my mind. Oh, Jesus.
The thing about basically being confrontational is that it attracts the wrong kind of spirit and the wrong kind of mindset. And so you're essentially like you're participating in this kind of drug experience when you sort of excite people by confronting the powers that be. And so when you think of it as a simple problem, you're always like, oh, here's something I can confront. I'm going to drive like, if I could basically take the Western tradition and get rid of Hegel, um, you know, sorry, I really don't mean to do this.
Yeah, just a group of Frenchies. I mean, now I know now it's Hegel, but I think he
Yeah,
keeps
yeah,
backtracking.
and that's honestly, and that sort of sense of sort of desire to purify, or the feeling that I was in something that was basically holy that had been profaned, was kind of my first experience of Western academia when I was going to Brown back in the 80s. Right. And I was like, oh, what is this French philosophy shit? This is all crap. My taste ran to like Mark Twain and Isaac Asimov, and really sort of plain, very Voltairean, kind of writers in general was really my early taste, just kind of lacerating and very, very clear. And so whenever I encountered what seemed to me just intentional obfuscation, I was like, wait a minute, these people are charlatans, right? But I didn't really associate this charlatanry with the fundamental nature of the place. I thought of it as an exception. And when you think of it as an exception, naturally you think, oh, here's this exception that can be corrected. Right.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. I think it's kind of the killing baby Hitler fallacy.
The
That
killing baby Hitler fallacy. That's a great name.
So, my next question is tied to community, and you see a lot of these kind of hyper real communities forming online, and the meat space
Hmm.
becomes less relevant. People are more disconnected, atomized. This is part of the big discourse now. Do you feel like there's hope for in real life community? How may people approach that? Is there kind of a lever that we can pull? Do we have any white pills
Well,
on the horizon?
I'd encourage. There's a wonderful book that I read recently because it was republished by one of these little publishers that are springing up, which is a really, really nice trend. I forget which publisher this was. It may have been Antelope Hill, but I don't think it was. They're the ones with the best covers, however. The might have been Imperium Press, and it's Fustel de Coulanges, the Ancient City, which is an amazing, amazing, amazing work. Fustel de Coulanges was a Victorian. He was a French Victorian, obviously, extremely aristocratic, extremely reactionary, extremely learned. You go through the footnotes for the ancient city. Um, and it's just it's just like this person has read the entire classical corpus. Okay, he's read everything right in the original, Greek and Latin, right, because he's actually educated. And here's this amazing book. Have you read Fustel de Coulanges? Have you, you
No,
know
but
of it?
I've had it recommended to me by multiple people,
Yeah.
including Patrick Deneen and Adrian Vermeule very recently. So it's on my
That's
reading
interesting. That's
list.
interesting. Well, I'm trying to spread the cult of Fustel and Silicon Valley as well. So I think that this is good things are happening here. Certainly, you know, the cult of the Machiavellians has been doing quite well. And this book is really it should be in the canon because what Fustel de Coulanges does is he essentially says, okay, you have this Enlightenment image of Greece and Rome, and your Enlightenment image of Greece and Rome is based on the late days of republicanism in both Greece and Rome, which are basically the late days of the greatness of Greece and Rome. And when you think of Athens as a democratic place, even Athens, not Sparta, Athens. When you think of Athens as a democratic place, basically you're taking the last like 100 years of Athens, and that's not where the power of Athens came from, right? And so, Fustel goes sort of all the way back to the Indo-European tradition and Indo-European religion, and essentially asks, what is the city? What is the community? And comes up with this essentially the interpretation of the ancient city as an extension of the ancient family, which is essentially like your god is the family god. It's very, it's sort of, to call it fascist is almost like fascism is like this caricature of the kind of ultra patriotism and ultra communitarianism that was expressed at an almost at really a completely religious level by the ancient peoples. And this is why sort of the Christian idea of the universal God is so strange. It was like the God is the God of the hearth, the God of the family. And it was very, very concentric circles, essentially. Right. And so, you know, later sort of Greek democracy is essentially, Greece kind of is the structure in decay. And when you realize that essentially, the Greek democracy is the exception in Greek history, it's sort of late. Really, what the Greeks themselves believed was that the Golden Age was actually Homeric Greece. You arrive at this, very BAP-like, worldview, which of course, I mean, BAP himself is obviously a very learned person as well, right? And so I mean, yeah. So you're essentially looking at, okay, here's what it means to be a community, right? And it's like I was reading, actually, who I've just gotten into, people will be shocked by this, is Ruskin. Ruskin, is in a way, he's the lib in a way, because Ruskin begets the Fabians, who basically beget the kind of whole administrative tradition of the 20th century. But Ruskin is also a student of Carlyle. And so reading Ruskin, he makes a point. This is unto this last, which is kind of the closest thing that Ruskin has to my old favorite, the Latter Day Pamphlets. And he makes this point. He's like, why do people um, throughout history respect soldiers and have contempt for merchants? And I don't mean merchants in the internet sense. I just mean people in a mercantile background and profession, right? And his answer is that merchants, by definition, their action is entirely self-interested, and whereas soldiers are participate in a community where sacrifice for the community is expected. And so, when I see an internet community or a virtual community of any kind, I was literally getting into this shit in the 80s, actually. Uh, the question that I have to ask is, like what is the depth of any such community? What is sort of the depth of like kind of collective sacrifice and collective engagement? How much do they work? How close to a cult are you? How close to worshiping the same gods are you? And I think that one of the things that you find when you ask this question, I mean, clearly, humans in the modern world are capable of these kinds of things. There's a kind of energy in like Burning Man. There's definitely a Fustel de Calange energy in Burning Man, right? And yet, we're essentially postmodern people. And, postmodern people are very different from pre-modern people. It's very hard to bridge that gap, even though you may have a certain kind of sympathy there. It's like, it's almost in a strange way, like some Yale graduate going to like relate to the inner city or something. It's like, okay, I sympathize with you. I kind of want you on my back, but like, I don't really speak the same language as you. Right. And when you have this kind of postmodern perspective where you've sort of been through modernity and you understand what kind of how to go beyond modernity, and then you're talking to people who are pre-modern and have not yet been through modernity, that's a difficult, it's like when you relate to say someone like Orban in Hungary, and like sort of traditional European populism. You're like, well, in a way you kind of get it, but in a way you kind of don't. And and bridging that gap, I find is very, very difficult.
Yeah. That kind of leads me to another question, because one of the biggest contrasts that I've seen is between essentially the Anglo tradition, and then you kind of have the continental tradition, and then you have places like Eastern Europe, which are completely apart. And to me, that I kind of to me that boils down to, in a way, to kind of this game theoretic equilibrium, where essentially you've been trained to defect in Eastern Europe. It's just that there's
Yeah.
no way out of this, this prisoner's dilemma that we've I don't know, feudalized our way into the Ottomans. There are many ways to lead to come to this
Right. You,
point,
you've
but
always you've always had some strange emperor or some strange ideology
yeah,
or
the
some
second you
strange
come up for air, someone comes up and snatches your little, little kingdom from under you. But I'm curious, why do you think, the solutions that would apply to the Anglo world, if there are solutions, if there is such a thing as solutions,
Mhm.
can they be translated in any way to Eastern Europe for whatever reason? You also have the Hainal line discourse. That's another one. But there's is it possible to even think in those parameters?
That's an interesting question. You know, I think that there's certainly I think that when you look at the history of the Soviet Empire, you get some clues as to that, because although it's a very different situation in some ways, you still have this informal empire, which is something that has happened many times in history, right? It's like the Delian League. It pretends to be a league of equals. In fact, there's nothing Polish about the Warsaw Pact, and so one thing that you see in the fall of the Soviet Union is there's this kind of rebound effect between the center and the periphery. And all of the world today is America's periphery, except arguably China, which has some self confidence. You know, but what happens in the fall of the Soviet Union is that the causality is central. And so you have basically this situation in which the center falls. And when the periphery sees the center falls, they're like, oh, that's interesting. And they sort of realize that these strings that have been holding them in place have kind of snapped in a way. And when they see this snap, they realize, hey, wow, Elena Ceausescu, is just some evil old hag, right? And and that realization is very, very powerful. And then in turn, because the periphery is much more unstable, then basically you have, the wave washes in both directions. And so essentially you have when the center says, okay, periphery, you can do whatever you want, and East Germany is like, oh yeah, well, we'll just let people walk over to the West then, because fuck it. And then the people in the center see that and they're like, wait, we had an empire. and and the whole thing sort of starts to, it's like it starts to emerge into visible reality as it collapses. Like you see, the kraken, kind of rises, and as it, and dies as it rises, essentially. And you're like, oh wow, there's some big tentacles there, because the tentacles are all falling apart. And so I think if you look back on, what a sort of a Trump administration, it's easy to say what a hypothetical Trump administration, which probably would have not involved Donald J. Trump, or would have involved him basically saying, okay, I'm going to go play golf, and I'll get someone competent in here. Um, and which he could still do in 2024, if you're out there, Don. And you know, but what an ideal Trump administration could easily have done is make it very, very clear. And this would have to be made by sort of enormous tangible gestures that, hey, Brazil, we don't care, the Monroe Doctrine is over. We don't care who's in charge in Brazil. To use a phrase from John Quincy Adams' original Monroe Doctrine address, this was the part for Europe, which I call the second Monroe Doctrine. The government de facto is the government de jure for us. So what that means is, hey, Brazil, you want a military government? You want to clean up those favelas? Go ahead, be our guest. We don't care. We'll keep buying your bananas or whatever, oranges. You want to restore the emperor. You used to have an emperor. It was cool. You could have an emperor again, whatever. You want to go full communist, go Bolshevik, right? Like work with Moscow. We don't care. And the thing is that, if you say that to all of these countries, they have this memory of a time, they have sort of a local historical memory of a time when they were much more autonomous. And when, if you look at, for example, like most people are like, wow, America backed, Pinochet, right? Well, America didn't back Pinochet so much as, commit to not opposing Pinochet. But if you look at Allende versus Pinochet, you see that Allende is a much more American figure than Pinochet. If you look at their social networks, Allende has friends all over the fucking East Coast. Pinochet is a figure who is completely Chilean, who would be out of place even in Argentina, right? And so, you have this natural tendency in which whatever is more local and whatever is more indigenous is also going to want to snap those strings. And so, if you can credibly say to all of these countries, the empire has fallen and will never return, then it's pretty easy. Moreover, there's a very, very easy way to do this, which is basically say, okay, we had, there's this whole system of diplomacy that we have. We have this whole State Department thing, which I grew up in, whose business is to run these embassies and consulates all over the world. Well, in the 18th century, that was super necessary because we didn't have the internet, but now we have the internet. So if Washington wants to say something to Bucharest, it can send an email. It can be like, hey, Bucharest, what's up? There's this guy in jail. People are asking about him. And if you basically say, we're pulling out of all our embassies, consulates, and bases, and we're just going to do business electronically, the message that sends is tremendous, because, of course, the actual role of the U.S. Embassy in Bucharest is not to, work with the Romanian government as a peer. It's not to be like, I think there's technically a treaty where if the US and Romania are involved in a war, if Romania is attacked, the US is obliged to defend Romania. If the US is attacked, maybe by Mexico, Romania has to send forces to keep, and these are the technical terms of the treaty. But in fact, the business of the U.S. Embassy in Romania is to supervise the government of Romania, right? And so if you basically say, you know what, whoever is in charge in Bucharest, That's the government of Romania. Iron Guard, what else, man? You know, if that's what you're into, that's what you're into. Okay, man. You were always pretty weird, whatever, right? And and in fact, here's what we'll do. How do we even know who's in charge of Bucharest? Well, it's very simple. We have satellites. You have QR codes. We're going to designate, the main square in Bucharest, wherever it is, and you're going to put a QR code there, and we're going to see it from space, and that'll be your email address, and that'll be the legitimate government of Romania for us, right? And so, if you can take the square and hold the square, you're the new regime, and we'll direct our emails to you if we have any emails. Really can't imagine what we'd have to talk about, but and
I'm
so
insulted.
if you say that's basically your new foreign policy, then the message that sends is unmistakable, and the message that sends to everyone in the periphery is that, or let's say, Romania, great country, never had any colonies, right? Okay, but then if you're talking to, say, France, you're like, hey, France, our empire's over, and by the way, France, if you want your colonies back, that's between you and them. And Algeria, lovely beaches. You can have it. Used to be part of your country. We stole it. You want it back? You can have it. You'll probably have to do some fighting, right? And so that level of isolationism basically sends a message to everyone in France that if I'm an ambitious young person in France, previously the only way I had of getting ahead was to go up this ladder. But now there's this other ladder, which has basically been created, which is a new kind of regime in France. I could go up this other ladder instead. And that's sort of always the question that you want to ask when you're asking about who's in power. It's like if you ask historically, okay, let's say it's 1956. Would you rather be on Senator McCarthy's staff or Edward R. Murrow's staff? Well, it seemed like Senator McCarthy was doing pretty well for a while, but he seemed to be in the driver's seat. But if you were a young person on his staff, your career was over, and if you were on Edward R. Murrow's staff, you're celebrated, and there will be 1,000 people at your funeral, right? And so that understanding of saying, okay, here is another form of sovereignty that can exist here. And since a lot of people want it to exist, it can come into existence relatively quickly. The thing is that the reason, if you look at, you're sort of running in this scenario, let's say you look at, say, the regime of Franco in Spain. Franco was a very indigenous figure. He was very Spanish. The Spanish regime today, or, let's say Ireland, in which, I'm always surprised that these Catholic trad, like the Rod Dreyers of the world don't talk much more about, the Amendevalera state in Ireland when it was basically a Catholic religious dictatorship, which is it was a working integralist state in the 20th century, and 20th century integralists don't seem to give a shit about it, even if they're Irish. What the fuck, right?
Well, now Google owns it anyway. They've given up. Google planted a flag
Google,
in Ireland.
Ireland is basically a subsidiary of Google, right? And the it's essentially a tax dodge, right? And and so what you had in those times was, but those regimes at the time, they didn't plan to last only 30 years, right? They planned to last, like every regime, forever. But what they found was, my mother was actually an au pair in Franco's Spain, of all places. Very, very sort of East Coast aristo thing to do. And so she ended up taking care of the children, the younger children of some Franquista admiral or something, like imagine like the uniform this motherfucker wears, right? And she's friends with the older daughter of, the admiral, who, of course, because it's 1965, is a communist, right? And so you can see the future of Spain in essentially the young people of Spain are sort of, all young people are kind of tuned to climbing the ladder. It's useless to admit that you're not, or to deny that you are, right? And so when you see um kind of circulations of the elite, it's because a different ladder emerges, or the existing ladder is very, very blocked. And what anyone could see in 1965 was that Franco wasn't getting any younger. Europe was about to go through an enormous cultural revolution. Everywhere, basically, the children of the post-war Europe, who'd imbibed the lessons of the teachers of post-war Europe, who had been installed by American tanks, were growing up with these deeply Americanized values, and they weren't going to stand for this old European shit. And so it was only a matter of time before those regimes crumbled. And so to run that, you can't run anything historically in reverse, but to do that over again in a way where you're saying, okay, now there is a vision of the future which is much more powerful and interesting than the vision of the future that the current regime is offering. That's sort of what, and that revision, that vision has to involve sort of a place for people like us, in the mind of someone who's going to find it attractive and find it sexy. And as sort of, as long as that, it was just much more sexy to be a communist in 1965 in Madrid than some kind of phalangist or something, right? Like the
Yeah.
Blue Division, right? And no, and so reversing that process is a matter of fashion, and it's fashion sort of follows power, and whatever is powerful is sexy, and there's sort of no getting around it. And so the way to create that revolution in the periphery is from the center. But what the periphery does with that is going to astonish the center. Does that make
Hmm.
sense? And have an effect back on the center again. And that's the sort of bouncing wave back and forth that you saw with the unraveling of the Soviet Empire. Long answer, but I do that.
No, no, I like this answer. I like it. It's got kind of this oracular vibe, and being in the periphery, I do like to think that this is where the counter elite will spawn.
Can I tell one story related to that, which
Sure.
explains in some ways the way the world works? Well, growing up in the State Department, I discovered a number of things, about the way the world works. And one thing that most people don't know is that it's a perfectly innocent thing. No secret slaughters of child prostitutes or anything like this. Every Thanksgiving, every U.S. embassy and consulate in the world has a party. The people who are invited to this party are, of course, the employees of the State Department and the consulate, and then everyone else in wherever they're located who is cool. And so if you meet someone at one of these parties, a fellow Romanian, you're like, oh, wow, Vlad, I didn't know you were cool. Oh, Mihai, I see you're cool too, right? And so, that is something that, that's just sort of one of these elite bonding factories that the world is so full of. And that's what sort of constructs those kinds of rituals and ceremonies and institutions are what construct the elites that we have today. And one of the things that I'm like, when you imagine all of those institutions swept away, until you imagine all of those institutions swept away, you can't really imagine a world that is governed in a different way. Because one of the problems of sort of being confrontational at any level is it's like these people who want to confront journalists, right? I'm like, dude, suppose you can get this person fired. Do you know how many people want their job? Like orders of magnitude, right? Like there's a huge line, and it doesn't even matter. Maybe they're not as good, whatever, right? Maybe you're getting into the B team. Like it's so useless. And the thing is that what actually happens in a true regime change is that all of these old paths go away. and they have to go away. They have to become completely null and void. And and so when you imagine, you're like, oh, we're going to reform this, we're going to fix that, then you look at, in some ways, the fall of the Eastern Bloc is not a good example because many of its institutions in many countries survived. The lustration was by no means complete anywhere. When you look at denazification, that was overdone in many ways. It was overly harsh. It was like, it's not a great example. It's not something Americans should be proud of. But you can't say it wasn't thorough. and well, I guess some communists say it wasn't thorough, but that was they're talking about the post 1947 period, really. And they're talking about the Cold War period when some of that was pulled back. But if you look at 45, 46, it's very, very harsh. And very, they're just like, we are going to have absolutely none of this shit. And that level, without any of that harshness, that level of institutional turnover is basically what you need. That also puts a limit on, that's a sort of totally different way of sort of doing business than the way that the Orbans and even to some extent the Erdogans of the world do business. And one of the problems with those regimes is that they see themselves as temporary in a way. They don't really have a telos, maybe more so Erdogan. But would you agree, disagree with that? Like, where does Orban think he's going? I mean,
You'd be surprised how strong the Hungarian nationalism is. They're just a sliver of a country, like a smattering of people, but by God, do they have like an
the
ethnos,
Treaty of
and they do
Trianon.
believe in
Yeah,
it.
yeah, 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 yeah. Well,
Yeah.
you'll never be able to forgive Woodrow Wilson for what he did. Uh, all right, for more questions. I've digressed enough
More
here.
questions. Okay. Religion. What is the future of religion in the upcoming regime or in the crumbling regime as we see it? As we said,
Well, I mean, religion today is certainly in America is everything is the same thing in a different skin suit, right? And I don't know. Have you seen Jude Law and the Young Pope? Are you a fan of the Young Pope? Do you know the Young
I
Pope?
haven't watched it. I've heard of it, but I haven't watched it.
It's really quite good. And the director Paolo Sorrentino is amazing. I don't know if you've seen La Grande Bellezza is really his masterpiece. Amazing film. He's really a fit successor to Fellini. And how this the Young Pope got on HBO, I will never fucking know because it's like completely unacceptable. And Jude Law really is this postmodern, in a way, neo-reactionary Pope, right? His basically stated mission in this is to eradicate homosexuals from the Catholic Church. Not to give away any spoilers, right? But yet, he's this kind of postmodern figure. And Which is really lovely. At the same time, I think it reminds us that, it's very hard, you know, it's very hard for a postmodern person to do anything pre-modern without it becoming, to a certain extent, a LARP. And LARPing is something that everybody's going to do a lot of in their 20s, frankly, and that's normal. That's fine. Keep it under control. But it's still a LARP, and it's very difficult. I mean, certainly if you've actually recovered a genuine faith, it. But to be the postmodern condition will always be a somewhat different one, and you sort of want to proceed with a lot of caution and delicacy in a way in trying to restore it, because ultimately it gets into, when as a postmodern person, I hate this word, but I don't really have a better one. When as a postmodern person, you're dealing with pre-modern people, you almost sort of feel this desire not to kind of contaminate or damage them. It's like you're dealing with, here in America, the Amish. You're just like, like the last thing I want to do with Amish is give their kids little plastic, phones that they'll get addicted to or something, right? And like the people who drop like phones on North Korea, for with the balloons, right? And these 11-year-olds will be in the woods with their little phone watching porn, and horrifying thought. And so, in a way, I'm just like, the idea of sort of bothering these people with my LARP is a little disturbing to me. At the same time, sort of religious psychology is very natural in humans. I certainly thought about trying the LARP of raising my kids in a religious way. It's way too late for that. But it would just be this sort of strange LARP, right? And you know, so I don't think that the thing is, in a way, religion in the modern world is a kind of endangered species. And most people, sort of in an enlightenment sense, when you hear that, you're sort of taught to they're an endangered species. You're just taught to think about them the way Americans used to think about the passenger pigeon. Like, let's finish them off. Who's the first to get the last one, right? And I'm like, no, this is actually an endangered species. And, like, actually, your first lesson in is not to, like, capture it and breed it in giant herds, but like just stop fucking with it, right? and um and so, anything that amounts to kind of fucking with these people is something, it's just too much like the infiltration of them that's been practiced so extensively in the 20th century, where you have all these, basically communists pretending to be Catholics, right? And I don't know that anybody knows the full depth of that. And the so as they one thing I forget where I read this was, someone said, in the Victorian era, that there were four great pillars of reaction in the European world, and these pillars were the English House of Lords, German General Staff, the Vatican, and the Economie Française. I think the Economie Française is still, kind of ticking along to some extent, right? And the others, and so I'm just like, the first thing to do is stop burning shit. And so, in a way, when you say, okay, I'm gonna like infiltrate this thing and use it as a tool, or like use it as like, a totem in some sense, I'm just like, man, you know, that's
Yeah.
like a
Do we
more
need
20th century behavior than you might realize.
reservations for these people?
Yeah, I think they need their own reservations. I'm
Yeah.
I'm a big reservation fan, but it has to actually work. Like, it shouldn't. It's like the South Africans had this idea of, okay, we have basically two civilizations here. We need reservations, but it kind of turned into like on the res essentially. And if you're going to do that with human beings, you better fucking do it right.
Yeah. Yeah, that seems to be the case, because a lot of people are talking about separation in many different contexts: separation, segregation, enclaves, and creating states and states.
I think that's a result of obsession with geography. I think that the way that you actually do that is just that you recognize people's self-selected status, and you're like, oh yeah, you're a red American, your kids go to the red school, right? And like, why the hell, like, would you be like, no, your kids can just go to the blue school and get all the blue shit, right? What are you like? You're still trying to put society in a blender. No, it's just like you identify as part of this community. You want the community to be, as much as possible, like, sort of financially self-sustaining. You want it to develop, as much as possible. You want to create an environment where these kinds of communal ties naturally grow, rather than naturally being minced up constantly. You certainly want to establish the principle that parents can choose what tradition their children are educated in. Um, you know, and and that implies basically saying, oh, you're a citizen of this tribe. And but even then, one of these tribes is basically the postmodern tribe of, libertarian individuals like me. I'm not a member of any red tribe, and so it's not really so much as, political as communal. And it's just a matter of saying, okay, we're gonna let you maintain your sort of own tradition. As far as geographic segregation goes, like, what's the purpose of that? Like, one group causes more car accidents than the other. Like, you shouldn't really be having like systemic crime or anything, right? Like, there's no, cooties. I mean, you
Not to you
know,
because you're a libertarian, but ask someone who's a bit more.
yeah, well, cooties. I mean, disease is certainly a real thing, right? Litter is a real
No,
thing.
but like mimetic disease that people
Oh,
don't want.
mimetic disease. No, yeah, I think that basically, let's say you're a Mormon. I think that, the Mormons are a great example of a community like this. Mormons don't need to be like confined to like some kind of like Mormon ranch with like barbed wire to keep the Mormons out, or the Gentiles out, or the Mormons in, right? Like, Mormons live among us. Like, there are, probably Mormons within a few hundred yards of me, right? And yet I don't feel any like kind of miasma of Mormon mimetic, memes coming over the fence to like teach my children to find some golden plates, right? And the Mormons have this amazing communal structure. I'm like, when I talk about, these people who want to form intentional communities, I'm like, fine, okay, so how much is everybody in this community going to tithe to the community? How, let's start with the Mormon 10%, right? And they're like, oh, yeah, well, I don't really want to sell my crypto. I'm just like, in the words of the great Bronze Age pervert, you're gay, right? And the so and it's fine, like, it's fine to be gay, but you should know you're gay, right? And that's where the sort of danger of LARPing comes from. I'm like, great, have communities, have a blast, be yourselves, just don't think that you are anything but what you are. Don't actually think that you're some like Indo-European tribe, crossing Scythia in wagons, right? And this is not what you are. And so, certainly, libertarianism for postmodern individualists is the right form of government for postmodern individualists who live in a postmodern way. Great, actually, for those people, it should be more progressive. It should be more libertarian, right? But this is exactly the reason why, say, Elizabethan England had different laws for than for nobles as for commoners. And so, yeah, you need to, if you're a Mormon, you know, your children should be going to Mormon school. That should not like cost you extra, like paying the fucking Mormon tax, like it's a fucking jizya, right? Your children should be going to Mormon school. They should be growing up as Mormons. And if they turn out to have like some like fucked up gender identity disorder or something, yeah, probably Mormonism is not the right place for them. They should probably move to San Francisco. And that's like, you know one of the things that the Amish have done so well is that they have this escape protocol, right? And so it's like, if you don't fit into this traditional society, fine. But, at the same time, I think the Amish traditional society would be much healthier if they had, sort of more of an Amish kind of leadership class and intellectual class. I don't think there are any Amish intellectuals. It's funny. Do you know the historical origins of the Amish? They're Mennonites, and the Mennonites were originally Anabaptists, and the Anabaptists were the people who did the Munster Rebellion, which was like something out of like Pol Pot, but in the 16th century, and this insane like cult republic that took over the whole city of Munster. And they evolved into the Amish, and the Amish have what works about being Amish is that they're so good at basically being non-confrontational. They're like, we don't even vote in your fucking English elections. Because basically, if we voted in your fucking English elections, people would start to give a shit about us. And we don't want that. And that's just such great advice for all dissidents. Like, people would start to you don't want the world to give a shit about you. It's like recently there's been this spate of attacks on Substack. They're not like, they don't go after me, they go after like Jesse Singal and all these people on the edge of legitimate discourse. I get ignored, which is exactly what I want. And the and and in exchange for that, I'm like, I don't I don't cause trouble, I don't bother them, I don't, and that's exactly what the Amish do. And that's sort of where, so you don't need necessarily physical reservation. You just need to say, okay, let's face it, we're not living in a homogenous country, and we're not living in a country that can be homogenized. It has these different groups of people. They're real, they exist, and the thing to do is basically to recognize them, let them kind of govern themselves, restore themselves, and kind of restore some self-confidence. And that means essentially that you can't be saying to these groups, oh, we're going to take your kids and we're going to teach them our bullshit. We're going to take your best and brightest, and we're going to send them to our schools, and then bring them home. Take them away from you to destabilize your communities, right? No, you can't be doing that shit, right? And that's that applies to sort of all traditional communities. But once you're post traditional, there's basically no systemic help for you, and that's a reality which all of us post traditional people who are all individuals have to cope with in our own individual way. But we can't pretend to not be what we are.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Kind of to track back to the Substack subject. I thought that was really interesting because you said you're not bothering anyone, but do you think that's the source of you not being attacked, or is it that they know that you're not a good target because you'd know how to fight back, one, and you're not looking for legitimacy in their system. You're not looking for them to approve of
Yes,
you.
both of those. I mean, looking for legitimacy in their system is kind of the essence of what I would describe as confrontationalness, or it's one essence
Okay.
of that, because you're basically saying, essentially, you're kind of fighting them in detail, and so you're basically saying, okay, this is bad, this is wrong, um, and when you sort of pull back, they're not really equipped to defend this whole system. They don't even think of it as a system. They don't, they're like fish who don't have a theory of water, right? And so when you start talking about their theory of water, you want, you want to be a difficult target essentially for the 2 minutes hate. And the way to be a difficult target for the 2 minutes hate is you have to, there's, the great joke of the bear in the running shoes. I'll tell
No.
it anyway. So there's a couple of hikers, um, um, and they're wandering in the wilderness, and you have bears there, but I believe they're not very aggressive bears in Romania, and yeah, varies.
Yeah, they're chill. They're pretty chill.
Yeah, yeah, we have we have black bears where I am. They're also pretty chill, but they're bears. But the hikers are wandering in the wilderness, and they encounter a bear, and the bear starts to come at them, and one hiker sits down and starts to take off his hiking boots and put on his running shoes, and the other hiker's like, what are you doing? And the hiker with the running shoes is like, well, I don't have to be faster than the bear, I just have to be faster than you, right? And so when you're essentially a dissident, defense is not a matter of being faster than the bear. Nobody can be faster than the bear. Dissidence is a matter of being faster than all the dumb people. And regrettably, there are always a lot of dumb people. And when the number of sort of targets of dumb people increases, that although it kind of excites the bears and creates kind of a bear feeding frenzy, which is a little bit dangerous, it also kind of leads, you know, one of the things that most people like don't understand about this system is that it's really not centralized. It really there's no central command and control, which is very, very different from the
Counterintuitive. Yeah.
counterintuitive and very different from the Eastern European situation. So everything we sort of know about being a dissident from the Eastern European situation, assumes that there's basically some kind of central, force there. And certainly if you were an influential intellectual of any kind in dissident intellectual in Eastern Europe, there's like a team of people, devoted to fucking with you. Right. And that's not the case here. What you have is a bunch of agencies that are bureaucracies. Some are governmental agencies, some are not. And they're basically devoted to finding funding by sort of playing up a certain kind of menace. And You want to not fit that narrative. Never fit the narrative of the state's narrative of its enemies. Always, skip away from fitting that. And so you essentially want to be a very inedible target. You want to be like, okay, if you start chewing on me, are you promoting me? Like maybe you're promoting me. Like what do you bite on first? What do you like? Why are you promoting the relevance of this person? You have to like, and so you essentially have to, y- you know, you have to put yourself in a position where it's clear that maybe you're scoring an own goal here. And you don't really moreover, you're muddying the narrative a lot because basically what you're saying is that the enemies of the state are people like this, which is always what you're doing when you publish a story. Well, that's sort of the last, as long as you don't fit that stereotype, you're sort of the last person that they want to promote as, their sort of official enemy. They want to promote the worst people. And so when you're not the worst people, they're just like, no, this isn't right. This isn't. And if they were your enemy, they would actually realize in a strategic sense that the best people are more dangerous than the worst people, but they're not your enemy. They're just predators. And as predators, which is sort of their, follows their bureaucratic tradition, they know sort of very well that, this is just not a very edible prey species. It's still a prey species. And as a prey species, basically, if you have an enemy, you want to counterattack that enemy. You want to confront that enemy. But as a prey species, basically, if you're a buffalo, your only concern with lions is that the lion not eat you. Like,
Mhm.
you don't like go out hunting lions, you don't eat lions, lions are not your food. um, um, your concern is that you not become a lion's dinner. And, certainly, every kind of PR mistake I've made in the past, and I've sort of made a few, is basically, sort of mistakes of just like, getting involved with lions in the wrong way. Your only goal is not to be the lion's dinner.
Mhm.
And as
And
long as you sort
how do you make yourself inedible? Is there a strategy? Just reject the framing completely,
yeah,
or
reject the framing, be extremely non-confrontational, and don't fit the narrative. Be someone that basically, you know can't be described in the way that, I mean, well, as sort of anyone can be described as anything, but the sort of, truth is always a constraint on these people. They always have to, they can bend that constraint, but they always have to deal with it. And so, to like, in a sense, the I don't know if you ever read the great Henry Harpending, African buffalo story, in which he, Harpending, the great anthropologist who worked with Greg Cochran, a name you might know, was worked in Africa for many years, and eventually was with a bushman, and a buffalo was truculent, and so they killed the buffalo, and the buffalo was completely inedible. It was like eating a piece of wood, right? It's just all this like, you know, pure collagen, essentially. And you might be able to boil it for a week and eat it, and the equivalent of that collagen in sort of a dissident is, every fiber of your body has to be just amazing. Every fiber of your body has to be completely non-confrontational and harmless. Everything you do should look good. And, essentially, once you're in this position where basically everything you do looks good, it's just like, I have to turn this thing that, I have to admit looks good into something that is like the 2 minutes hate of the day. Well, you know what? As a journalist, I'm I could go hunt a zebra, right? There's a lot of zebra around, and I have to deal with this fucking big ass thing with fucking horns, and who writes these things that are like 7,000 words long. Like, yeah, I'm just like, no, like, actually, I don't want to deal with this, right? And those decisions are made individually, and so when people have to, like, those are not collective centralized decisions. And so, if there was a collective authority, he would be like, no, Agent Yunush, you must go after the buffalo, right? I don't care if you don't think the buffalo is good to eat, like, take down the buffalo. I know you can do it, right? And that's not the way our system works. And so if you model our system as, this system, I mean, There was always exceptions. Every actor in the system is random, but if you essentially, just avoid provoking it in any way, and you are absolutely inedible, you'll be pretty good at defending yourself. Does that make sense? Does that,
Yeah, of course.
follow
Does
from
it?
your experience as well? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, my experience is very short. I'm just about to make all the mistakes, but I do think living in the armpit of a periphery is it does help, at least minimizes stalker damage.
Sure.
But yeah, I'll move on to my next question, which is a stabby question, because you promise that things
A
would calm
stabby
down.
question.
Stabby question, because it's confrontational. This is about as stabby as I get, so
Yeah,
brace
yeah.
yourself.
Right. Yeah,
So
yeah,
you
yeah. Let's
promised that
yeah.
things would calm down once Biden was in office.
I think that things.
Doesn't seem.
I think that things. The way I think that let me be clear about first of all, like, this is 2 months, and let me be clear about basically what I already see and what I think I predicted. Other people may think differently. I hate going back and reading my own material, so I'll just let them think what they want. But the what you see is essentially a combination of the acceleration of bureaucratic energy and the loss of emotional energy. And the emotional energy is the leading indicator, and the bureaucratic energy is the lagging indicator. And so you're going to see more and more of this sort of stale kind of bureaucratic tripe, sort of coming down the path. And, if you measure, for example, like the degree of like Twitter repression, right? The degree of Twitter repression, like there's like clearly a thermometer of like Twitter repression. And I would love to know, what causes the Twitter weather, right, to go up and down. And how, how much of it is purely algorithmic. Are they just saying we're gonna just use an algorithm to find the shit posters? Who the hell knows, right? But I mean, it's sort of interesting because I think Bronze Age Pervert was suspended once. I know he was suspended once, but that was a long time ago, actually. Steve
Mhm.
Saylor, never been suspended. Never,
Yeah.
never. I post under
Oh,
his
for
real
2
fucking name.
weeks once, because he didn't want to delete a tweet,
Oh yeah,
but
yeah, yeah. I mean suspended. I mean, I mean quote
yeah,
suspended, right? I
yeah.
mean basically taken it and shot in the back of the neck and dumped in a ditch and sucked with gas and burned, right? And so you have this like the weird totalitarian, like this weird like virtual totalitarianism LARP where you're on Twitter and like you go to someone's door and there's just like a notice like this citizen has been seized by the do not attempt to contact and citizen, you are now being recorded. And so it has this kind of creepy totalitarian vibe, and that's why obviously real name posting on Twitter is this kind of a high wire act, in a way which I both recommend and recommend against. It sort of depends what you want to do with your account, right? and
Yeah.
and the so that's kind of a bureaucratic effect, and the kind of bureaucratic persecution that any of us, including me, may be subject to, and is ramping up in general. And what's ramping down is basically, like, if you go, for example, and you look at, say, a good thermometer of kind of mainstream leading indicator, is a site I've frequented for many years, and finally got fed up with being banned from about 10 years ago, but I still lurk on there, which is Hacker News. And one thing that you see is that basically, the temperature of that can be measured by, sort of moderation, like community mod votes. One thing you see is that basically in that thermometer is that the sort of support, the emotional elite support for, this like massive censorship campaign is draining away. So you basically look at, I can't tell you how many stories I've heard of people who are like, my woke sister was like, what the fuck is up with this Dr. Seuss thing, right? And so, you have these basically bureaucratic decisions that keep this bureaucratic energy of this thing keeps rolling forward. But out there in the real world, people are looking at this, what? Dr. Seuss? because he used the word Eskimo, right? What's wrong with Eskimo? I had an Eskimo pie just the other day. Did they change the name? Are they actually Inuit pies now? I don't know. But yeah. In any case, so that combination of basically here is this force that is in some ways getting stronger, but it is not getting cooler. It is losing its coolness rapidly, and it has basically President, Joseph R. Brezhnev, on TV, like mumbling and being about as charismatic as, Chernyenko, right? I think Brezhnev was a little more charismatic actually, but he had these eyebrows, and the guy, and so you have, from my perspective, from the perspective of, here, I'm a dissident, and I guess even a professional dissident. From my perspective, when I see sort of the waning energy, I'm like, that corresponds in a way to an increase in the energy available for people who are just utterly fed up with all this shit. And that's a growing set, and that's not necessarily aligned with like red versus blue. That's there are many people who are like, oh wow, yeah, I live in a big city, and I like the ethnic food, and I feel a sense of universal brotherhood, but what's up with this Dr. Seuss thing, right? And that that's just from a purely self-interested perspective, that's my audience. And so when I see the forces that grow that audience growing, I can't help but be a little kind of optimistic.
Yeah. Yeah. That kind of brings me back to what you said in the beginning, that, there might be a bit of an echo chamber effect where, you see these forces growing around you, but you've placed
Yeah.
yourself in the middle of these forces. So it looks like, oh my God, the tide is shifting. All my friends love this shit.
Yeah. Well, it's a small tide, but it's certainly is it growing? Yeah, it's growing. I mean, it's you just have to be you have to be patient, man.
Yeah, yeah, you have to be and adopt the Curtis Yarvin brand historical perspective. Place yourself outside of the maelstrom and
Yeah,
observe.
yeah. And just be like, wow, this is some crazy shit that's going on, and crazy shit is going on in the past. Your Romanian history is full of wonderful crazy shit.
Yeah, it continues apace. We've got
Yeah,
crazy shit
yeah,
happening
yeah,
every
yeah.
day
Well,
here.
yeah.
Cool. So this is the next question is from my friend Indian Bronson, and what is necessary for human elites to really give a shit about their charges on a scale that is beyond their immediate family? Is there any incentive that would make elites
Their
more?
charges, their charges. That's an interesting word. One of the interesting historical phenomena in European history is that of the absentee landlord. And one thing that, the answer to this question is basically obvious. One thing that the kind of precipitated the downfall of what's called Protestant ascendancy Ireland is this phenomenon of absentee landlordism, where you were in theory the lord of some district or castle or whatever, and instead you just like let your guy manage it and lived in London, and went out to Ascot or whatever the fuck, right? And and you became this like degenerate Tristafarian, right? And of course such a person had no social connection whatsoever to the motherfuckers who were paying their rents in their little cottages or whatever in the muck, right? And these are people that are taking care of their cows, that are making the butter that's sold at the market, that pay for the horse that places second at Ascot, right? And this is this is a very dysfunctional fucking relationship, right? And so in a way one can sympathize a little bit. I always try to sympathize with libs. One can sympathize even a little bit with the libs who are like motherfuckers, this is a very dysfunctional fucking relationship, right? And here you have this like established church in Ireland, which is the official religion of Ireland. And it's not even the religion of like 5% of Irishmen. Like, what the hell, right? This is like weird colonialism shit. And that's in some ways where the critique of colonialism developed, was in this Irish home rule movement, which of course eventually ends up being driven by London rather than Ireland. So, how do you sort of reverse that or change that is like, it's like, I mean, forget Mormons, the people that really had this, kind of sectarian elite thing mastered in the lives of those now living were the Catholics in America who had this whole alternate world of Catholic schools and Catholic, religious hierarchies, Catholic bishops, and these people, at the top of this hierarchy who rose up through the hierarchy, became significant players because they could go to mass and be like, vote for O'Leary. He's a good man, you know, um, and they were players, right? And that was an elite hierarchy to aspire to. It's impossible to imagine a young man from like the Catholic of unbounded promise from like Fishtown in Philly being like, oh, I got to go to Fordham so I can become a cardinal. Like what the fuck, right? And so in a sense, like restoring, if you're an elite that doesn't have contact with your charges, call them what you will, then you develop this kind of reckless attitude and you start sacrificing these people.
Mhm. Yeah, so it doesn't seem like there's any practical approach to reintroducing incentives.
It's a regime complete problem.
Yeah, yeah. I
But
mean that's fine. You're not here to solve all this stuff. You're a describer of
well,
of horrors.
I will we'll solve it in the next regime. But
Exactly.
all right,
So
next question.
I've got a next question. This is also from a friend of mine. I'm just helping my friends here find answers to their problems. This is from Rocco, father of the Rocco's Basilisk. Are you
Mm.
open to the idea of rule by, in parentheses, crypto smart contracts rather than rule by a physically embodied king? Is there?
Well, the problem with that's what we call in computer science an AI complete problem. And the given I mean I've written smart contracts. Ethereum is has roughly you know roughly the power of a digital watch from 1985, and it costs as much as a digital watch from 1985. So the idea of AI complete is one thing. Then the idea of AI complete on the blockchain is kind of another kind of quantum exponential leap there. The essential but the problem is in a way even worse than that because there's this influential book that Lawrence Lessig wrote about 20 years ago called Code or Laws Code or something like that. And of course, it made this same obvious analogy between law and code. Laws are literally called codes. And what, of course, we find is that law in that sense is sort of merely a backbone of procedure that has to be coupled with some exceptional power. And in reality, we say that the judge is enforcing the law, but of course, the judge is enforcing whatever the fuck the judge wants to enforce. And no one has ever devised a situation, you know, not only is no one essentially what you have to have government that is completely by procedure, which is essentially sort of the desire to have government by procedure comes out of the same sort of literally unruly desire not to be ruled, to have no one in charge. And people come up with kind of various formulas for this, and they're all cope. And the so to avoid this cope, basically, is to realize that all these systems of procedure eventually inevitably have an exception of some sort. There is always in any system there's just no imaginable system of sort of control of humans that does not contain an exceptional component. And in that case, when you say okay, you rule by smart contract or rule by AI smart contract, ruled by AI complete. As you do you know the term AI complete? It means basically is smart. Any problem that's AI complete is a problem that requires something that can think as well as a human.
Mhm.
And at present, really doing a good job of folding clothes. remains AI complete. It's actually really hard to deal with fabric, and for robots to deal with fabric, and so I think and so that's a measure of how difficult we are. We're at the level of, here's something that you could teach a chimp to do, and fold, chimp versus robot folding clothes. That would be an interesting contest, actually. um and you could have it every year, beat the chimp. And the um in any case, going from that to sort of becoming the supreme overlord who decides the exception in Schmittian terms is it's quite a leap, and I don't think it's sort of in the world of things that it's realistic to think about. But we can go one step further than that and say that even if we had an AI complete AI that was much much smarter than a human, I think it would have great difficulty in occupying and even sort of retaining this position unless you go full Skynet and give it direct cryptographic control of all the weapons, in which case I kind of recommend against that. But the
Yeah.
but in but unless you're doing things that way, sort of all rule happens by essentially is a social process of convincing the ruled that this is someone to follow. And one that requires what psychologists call a theory of mind,
Mhm.
which requires you to actually, empathize with the person on the other side. One thing that's well known in management theory that most people don't know is, I think the military did these studies and found that if there's an IQ gap of more than 15 points between the officer and the people he directly supervises, the command relationship can't really form. Maybe 15, and maybe more like 20 or 30, but there's definitely a level at which they just don't fucking understand you. And you can't really, the theory of mind, and anyone who's been around smart kids has seen this, they basically just don't have a theory of mind that lets them understand normies. Actually, the disconnection goes in both directions. And so when you have this AI, which is not even human at all, forgetting its IQ, which is, let's say it's infinite, people don't understand how it thinks. And because they don't understand and can't understand how it thinks, they can't really form an emotional bond that allows them to serve it. Maybe they worship it as a god, but you're getting into some really weird shit here. and
Yeah.
and I don't think that's where Rocco wants to go.
Yeah, I have that feeling as well, and I think the alternative that I keep hearing about this idea of being ruled by machines, being ruled by AI, is that the quality of stimulus that's going to come from the basilisk or whatever Leviathan AI that we're going to construct is going to be essentially numbing. It's going to just it will change the nature of the relationship of the ruled. It's going to be the infinite slop machine where you just connect and that's it. It's essentially the Matrix. That's the
Yeah,
scenario.
well, I mean that depends on the objectives of the AI, but it's like it's another it's I think it's interesting to see the sort of the degree of the depth of, forgive me for calling it a cope, but I think it is a cope in which basically, and I remember, like, as a libertarian, you're really a victim of this cope, and I really would have called myself a libertarian for many, many years. You're basically like, you sort of see the beauty of this system that doesn't have this, human element, and especially doesn't have this hierarchical human element that seems distasteful to you. And this is because, as a libertarian, you're basically a disobedient child at heart. And you probably were a disobedient child as a young person. And you basically still have that attitude, which is just the wrong, I mean, is a terrible attitude. There's a great, I've inflicted this saying on my children a few times. There's this great saying, which is an old saying of a Prussian pre 20th century general, which is, those who wish to command must first learn to obey. And until you basically learned that skill of kind of following and obeying, which comes so unnaturally to a person like me, which I don't really have, but which I sort of very much respect in a kind of intellectual meta tradition, until you have that ability, you're still a child in a way. And a large part of the old system of education was to basically impart that skill to adults so that they wouldn't be dysfunctional in large organizations, right? And so, you have this group of basically dysfunctional people who don't really fit together in any sense, except the sort of, Carlyle's phrase, the only nexus between man and man is cash. They sort of fit into this kind of libertarian cash economy as kind of individual contributors, and even their ideal form of company is a decentralized, is a flat management structure. They know this can't work. They keep trying it. But they basically want it to, every time a person with this mindset sees a way to do things, and there are sometimes, excellent ways to use this technique. Every time they see a way to do things with a crowd instead of a structure, they're like, "Ooh, we could do things with a crowd." I'm like, "Yeah, motherfucker, you can do it with a structure, right?" But a structure involves this idea of commanding and obeying. It involves this kind of central point. It involves humans following the orders of other humans, and that's just very distasteful to these, pathetic motherfuckers that we are these days.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, sounds sounds a bit like a dead end until we teach
Yeah,
ourselves Prussian what's that called? Mind frames or thinking
yeah, yeah.
patterns. Yeah.
The Prussian mindset. Yes. Uh,
I
more
want
questions.
to also, yeah, I want to ask you about the fertility issues that people are encountering nowadays. It's even called the fertility crisis, fertility collapse.
Well, the way to, there's that's a purely personal problem. The
Very libertarian
uh,
of you.
very very well. The thing is that, yeah, I mean,
It's
it
not an
shows
accusation. It's a systemic problem. It's
it's a
happening in
system
the
it's a
world.
it's a systemic problem, and arguably it all comes from, the Declaration of Independence, and this phrase, the pursuit of happiness. And people have this, like, eat pray love mindset, right? And even people who aren't 43-year-old wine ants. And and the 43-year-old wine ant phenomenon is just the result of, this condition lasting too long, and the the funny thing is like, is a it's like, there's no better way to explain this than sort of the feeling of like traveling as being a parent, right? Because let's say I, go to Rome, right? The idea of going to Rome as, or, I never, no, I was in Rome as an individual. The idea of, but it was like a business thing, so I didn't get to see much of Rome. But the idea of being, in Rome as like a single tourist is one thing. The idea of being in Rome with your wife is a much better and much funner thing in every possible respect. And then when you have like a 2-year-old, you're like, wow, I could be in Rome with my wife, or I would be in Rome with my wife and this screaming monster, right? And wouldn't it be wonderful if we could just like stroll around without the screaming monster? And then when you're like, at a certain point, that flips around, and now you're like, wow, the only reason it's fun to go to Rome is to like show my 10-year-old Rome, right? And have her be amazed by that. Um, and I would be like, why would we want to go to Rome without our kids, right? That's ridiculous, right? It would be so boring. Like, what would you do? We're like, oh, painting, cool painting. Yeah, wow, yeah. And so, having that, certainly that idea of like parenting, and just exposes you to a completely different sense of kind of the purpose of existence. And then, once you're a parent, you basically look back at your single friends and you're just like, oh, I see your purpose in life is to have fun. Well, have fun with that, I guess. They have to have a lot of good drugs these days you can take. And so like that leads to, this idea. I mean, the people who wrote Pursuit of Happiness didn't even really mean it this way, right? They meant, by happiness, they really meant human fulfillment. They didn't mean, debauchery, right?
Yeah, yeah, much more Aristotle, less
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
OnlyFans. Yeah.
less less Marquis de Sade, right? And so essentially, this vision of the purpose of life and community has really been transformed into the vision of the Marquis de Sade. And I think there's a lot of trends in that today that the Marquis would be really very happy with. And we're basically living in Pasolini's Salo, more and more every day, right? And um,
Yeah, at
in some
least
ways,
they
not in
knew.
others.
At least they knew that you
Yeah,
would turn into like a pillar of salt, and they had that in the back of their
yeah,
mind. Now we need to
yeah,
normalize
yeah.
it. Don't
Now we
even
now.
flinch.
Oh no, yeah, the devil needs you to go even farther, right? And so, like, when I look at sort of it's like earlier you asked about religion. I think it's very difficult for a person with a postmodern upbringing to become religious. I think what they should do is their first step is to learn to actually respect it, and at least to if you're going to have to be an atheist, don't at least be an anti-theist, right? And that alone is a huge step, right? And then to actually to sort of to even be able to learn from religious traditions. There's a famous event where Oriana Fallaci, the famous Italian journalist, went
Mhm.
to interview, I think it was
Based,
John Paul
very
II.
based.
Yeah, very, very, very based, who became very based, but in earlier life was very radical. She goes to interview, I think it's either Benedict or John Paul I think it's John Paul II. And she's like, well, I'm just a complete fucking atheist. I don't believe in God at all. What the fuck should I do? And he's like, child, just act as if you did. And,
LARPing. I'm a proponent of
yeah,
it.
yeah,
Very
yeah,
good.
yeah, 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 yeah. Pretty smooth, right? Like that's like Dalai Lama tier, right? And the so that's a further step, and then to sort of to actually sort of get over yourself and kind of stop believing that the modern world has or even really can discover a way to live which is thanks to our fabulous luxuries, revises the lessons of 3,000 years of classical civilization, is just ridiculous. And a lot of people go through their life living this way, and certainly a lot of women go through their lives basically past their fertile years, and most women still have kids too late, but at least they have some at all. And yeah, that's totally an element of this modern condition, and it's a result of the sort of, the status functions of the 20th century, where you're essentially gaining all of this status, which is suddenly no longer social but professional status. So a woman who is actually just a matriarch has no status in this regime, whereas
There are
actually,
no
as the word
matriarchs.
as the word matriarch implies, actually,
Yeah.
that was actually a thing. Like, people wouldn't have that word if it didn't exist. Lady Catherine de Bourgh, or like whatever, right? Like, you ain't fucking with her. And Livia Soprano, even, right? And these are real characters. And so people, women are relentless status chasers anyway, let's be frank, right? And so that's really, I think, done a lot of damage in a lot of different ways.
Yeah. Yeah, I
So
think
probably the answer you expected, but
for women, it used to be that you used to chase someone else's status, and that was enough. But now, you kind of have to do double duty, which is
yeah, yeah,
yeah, quite
no,
quite the strain. Yeah, related to this, you're a married man. I am a married woman. We've made it. We've made it on the other side. Obviously, life is long, and we'll see. But what people want to know, do you have any recommendations on how people can find a mate? Because, being our prophet,
I
maybe
have
you have something to say about this.
I think that I have none, but I think I'll venture one anyway, which is that the most important thing is filtering out the inappropriate. And the the you know there are different human personality types and different human mating types, really. And especially among women, I think men are much more consistent and women are much more different. And so there's a kind of for men, there's a very different sort of wife psychology is kind of should be instantly recognizable as a kind of basedness in the sort of most, not even necessarily political, but kind of most emotional sense of the word. The women you're going to have problematic relationships with guys are women who are needy, or like broken in various ways. You definitely want to kind of steer clear of that. And that's like, I mean, for men, the most important thing is just self-confidence. Like self-confidence is what women want. There are other things, but they're all much smaller.
I can confirm that
um,
that's essentially it. There's nothing else. Yeah.
there's basically nothing else. And so just be excellent. For women, resist your urge to insist on bad boys. I don't know. I mean,
Yeah.
and the other thing, I mean, it really is true that, um, unfortunately, but sadly, I think my experience is that sexual experience is damaging for a woman in a way that it's not necessarily damaging for men, like psychologically. And that's like you can tell women who basically um have just gotten too obsessed with that lifestyle. They have a different look in their eyes, and it's just not a very healthy look. And
Yeah, it's
that is
it's
what
a
it is.
it's a vicious circle. Yeah, that's the thing. The more you hung up in that lifestyle, the harder it is to get out because people see
Yeah,
it. It's a
yeah,
look.
yeah.
It's a sparkle. It's an
The hard eye, the
anti-sparkle.
hard eyes, the hard eyes. Yeah, yeah. No, it's a terrible thing.
Yeah,
Um,
I'm sorry to. This is a bit of a black pill, but with probably like 3 women watching this, so it's all fine. Um, in terms of
well,
yeah,
I'm always
and
politically
yeah.
correct.
Yeah, I mean, I wish, I'm trying to be the, to reach out to the female community to, step into fringe right wing politics with me and
Well,
let's.
how Alex, if I may ask, did you get red pilled, as it were? Like what the
Oh,
tip you were looking at?
since you're asking, I actually, I mean, it took a while. It probably started about 10 years ago. I read the blank slate, and that kind of threw me for a loop. I was like, whoa,
Hmm.
because I had like a gender studies degree, so you could imagine what was floating around in my head.
Did
Um,
you ever study in the UK or the US? Did you?
no, I've lived in the UK for 5 years, but that was during my working years, and I studied at the Austrian School of Economics, and then I studied in Spain at another economics thing. But yeah, I did diversity management and all sorts of trendy shit that was cool back then,
Right,
and
right,
and then somehow through a forum I found Nickland. Through Nickland, I found qualified reservations about like 4 or 5 years
right.
ago, and then I was a totally totally lost case. So that's
Yeah,
here we
many,
are.
many, many, many such cases.
Exactly. Yeah. So girls, if you're
Yeah.
listening, that's the stuff
All
you should
12 of
say.
you.
Exactly. Oh, 12 is nice. Thank you. um, Related to the family subject, you have children. I am in the process of
Mhm.
creating life myself.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you.
Do you have a due date? Do you have a
Yeah, it's in July, so
if,
at the beginning of July, quite
Yeah,
quite soon.
congratulations.
I'm
That's wonderful.
expanding as we
Yeah.
speak. So homeschooling, or should I give my children, the Lord of the Flies treatment and just send them to public school and see
It
them.
depends on the parents, it depends on the kids, it depends on everything in the situation. We're homeschooling now. We had them in a private school. Language immersion is an excellent thing. My kids speak Chinese, which is advantageous, I feel. And we've been keeping that up with in homeschooling with various things. The Despite the corona insanity, obviously homeschooling is far superior in corona world. Hopefully we won't remain in that world. The um the thing that in a way, my answer is sort of related to this, which is I'll answer a question that a lot of fellow parents ask me, which is basically how do you teach your kids in this world in which this insanity is pumped into their brains. And I think a lot of the reasons that parents opt for homeschooling is to basically prevent that process. And I understand that it and of course it varies for every child, and you'll know sort of how rebellious your child is. I always joke that one of my children is a Jew and the other one is an Aryan, because they have different levels of rebelliousness. And the But they're both, rebelliousness definitely runs in my family, so they both have a fair component of it. So the thing is that this might not work for some kids. So, any parenting advice should include the phrase, this should not might not work for some kids. The thing that you can do is basically imagine that you're living in a Catholic country, but you're an atheist or a fucking Jew or something like that, right? I was in this situation, right? Because I was in when my father was posted to Cyprus, I was in Nicosia and I went to the English school, which was a sort of odd choice because it was a faux British public school rather than the American school. And we not only did we wear uniforms, we had to sing Anglican hymns every morning, and RI, which meant religious instruction, was on the menu, on the schedule. They finally decided that for RI, I would get to sit in the library, which I think was probably the best choice uh, in several different respects. But imagine that you're living in a super Catholic country. You're sending your child to a Catholic school, but you're not actually Catholics, and you're not giving them any Catholic indoctrination at home. This child is not going to grow up believing that the wafer actually turns into Jesus in your mouth. That is not going to happen. He'll just be like, what the fuck? Right. And if it is his world that is reinforced on all sides, absolutely he will deeply internalize whatever sort of religious absurdities he's asked to believe. And of course, an absurdity is this to all Catholics listening, and an absurdity is the same thing as a miracle, as Hume pointed out, right? And so the question is, does he believe in miracles? Does he have faith? And if this faith, whether it's Catholicism or wokeism, is installed only at school but not at home, that is a recipe for the child to learn their own form of doubt. Because and so you're actually teaching them to think skeptically in a way where it's not apparent to anyone that you're doing this. And so what happens is the child starts to see their own cracks in this, and it's never reinforced
Mhm.
at home. And so they're just like, wait a second. And then eventually they start driving the process, really. And then at a certain point you sort of switch over to the point where what you really have to worry about with them is teaching them how to control the power level, which is a much better problem. Still a hard problem, but it's a much better problem than the other problem, right? And so that way of basically saying, okay, I'm going to expose you to all that society believes in, has a couple of different benefits. The first one is they learn to hide their power level. They learn to basically conform. They learn to basically behave like all the other kids. Very important life skill. And secondly, they develop these doubts because they're seeing these absurdities and they're not being told to believe them at home. And so that's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is just raise them in a goddamn bubble and like let them know that the world outside is the pit. right? And to not coin a phrase, right? And the that's an approach which I believe works for some people. Of course, it's a little more of a high wire game in some senses. The other thing about taking the approach, that I advocated and that I've taken is sort of your worst case scenario is that your child ends up a true believer, which is going to be potentially pretty shitty for your relationship with them. However, for them, it might be ideal, right? So, it's kind of, you've got a kind of win win situation going on when you do that. And, the more important thing about homeschooling versus public schooling is just the incredibly shitty quality of the schooling that you'll get, which is probably honestly a lot better
Yeah.
in Romania in some ways. Um,
Yeah, it
Certainly in
depends.
math.
Yeah, it used
Yeah.
to be. It used to be like it's
Yeah.
subject to the
Yeah.
same entropy as everywhere, and yeah,
Yeah,
it's,
yeah. Well, that's one of the things the Soviet system was good at, right? And
yeah. You
you
you need
can't say they was
centralized control for some things. Well, math,
they were a
apparently.
lot. They were bad at a lot of things, but math was not one of them.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah. I that was a cool
yeah,
thing about our school even when I was there. We had these Olympics, and even though the quality of the schooling in general was kind of, shitty, post transition, post communism style, the
sure.
Olympics were really hardcore because the teachers would kind of take you apart and said, "Oh, you're high potential. Okay, you're going to the Olympics." So they would you essentially have parallel class and
You're
they
going to,
teach you
yeah.
whatever you wanted to learn. So yeah,
Wow.
I don't know if that's
And were
still
you on
going
the?
on.
Were you on the Olympic? Were you
I
on
was
the
on
Olympic track? Were
several
you
several Olympics, but I have to say I wasn't on the really cool ones, on the
several
physics
Olympics?
and math ones. Yeah, no, I was at the biology Olympics. I was the national biology Olympics
Oh
girl.
yeah.
But yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
not
yeah, yeah. But that's, I mean, you must have grown up with sort of all of these kind of remnants of the Soviet system around you, even though you never sort of experienced them as kind of directly. But you must,
yeah, it's like a haunt. It was a haunted place. It was haunted by this idea of communism. No one really knew exactly what communism was. We just called
right?
communism old stuff, like the apartment blocks, communist. The old
Yeah,
teachers that were like, wearing a weird looking, ill-fitted suit, they're communist. So it was just
yeah.
a thing. But in a way, everything was kind of communist because you were learning from like communist material. Like I went to a
Oh yeah,
German
yeah,
school, and it had it was all about the grain quota, and Stefan's mother is a heroin mother because she's like she brought
yeah,
in
yeah, yeah, yeah.
the quota from the grain field and all this stuff. So it was just like kind of
They just
strange.
hadn't And they just hadn't cleared all that stuff out yet, which I'm sure they have now.
Yeah.
And yeah, no, it's a when I was in that school in Cyprus, we got this mix. It was a strange mix of like old, pre-war English tradition, where you memorize, a poem by Shelley or whatever, and then you had these textbooks that were like 1970s Fabian Red Brick University British textbooks, where which were like pure new left. And it was sort of strange encountering this, like these are very different things, like what's going on here, right? And
Yeah, but
I mean
it
this
does
is like
help.
full Harry Potter. There are houses, we're organized into houses, right?
Do you think
And
it was like it added to your, essentially almost automatically dissident perspective to have, grown up in these weird liminal spaces and
oh
seeing.
sure, oh sure, oh sure. I mean, Cyprus was so strange because they had this strange ethnic conflict, right? And one day I'm I guess 11 and I go to school and we don't have the internet there. I hadn't checked the news and I wind up in class and I'm in, the English school is a somewhat international school, but it includes a lot of just like the international class of Cypriots, right? So there's still Cypriots, and I go to school, and it turns out that Turkish Cyprus has declared independence. So this is 83, 84, something like that. So obviously, there's going to be no school today. Obviously, school is going to turn into a demonstration, which is going to turn into a riot. And I was all for going with the demonstration. My brother grabs me, and he's like, "No, we're going home." and, but I'm like, "Holy shit, man! Let's kill the church, right?" And you sort of just see the emotion of being in one of those riots, one of those mobs. You've seen, of course, all the videos from old Romania with the hole cut out of the flag, and it got intense there for a while, but it's still, even that movement on the scale of 20th century craziness is very small,
Yeah.
and so you're seeing, you're certainly seeing this kind of decline in energy, but
Yeah, exactly. Are you ready for the quick fire round? Where I have
oh, sure.
a few questions that, you could just say yes, no to,
All right,
just
I'll try to keep 'em I'll try to keep it really short.
curiosities.
Right,
Number one,
right.
do you know who the real Satoshi Nakamoto is? Yes, no.
No.
Okay.
Um, Probably not.
Probably not. Okay. Yeah,
I have a
people
guess,
keep
but I'm not
hoping.
I have a guess, but I'm not sure.
Okay. You won't share that guess with us.
No, I won't, but it's a common guess, so it doesn't matter.
Okay. Do you own a sword?
No.
Your diet and fitness regimen, very shortly.
Terrible.
Terrible. Okay, like libertarian, I understand. What toothpaste are you using, and is it still Tom's of Maine?
It remains Tom's of Maine. I'll always be a devoted Tom's of Maine user. Sometimes I can use the sweet toothpaste if I'm traveling and there's nothing else, but
I'm all
Tom's of
yeah.
Maine.
I don't know what Tom's of Maine is, but I'm also an anti-sweet toothpaste person, so I agree. It has to be vile, or else it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Do you still believe Hitler was gay?
Yes.
Okay.
No question.
Have you ever been in a room with Dan Crenshaw?
No.
This is an interesting question. It's from Jeffrey Miller, the evolutionary psychologist, biologist. Will Martian
Something like that.
colonies have to be governed by a neo-cameralist or formalist structure to work at all, given the danger of schisms on a hostile planet?
The problem is I can't really see Martian colonies as very realistic anyway, so I can't really answer that question because it's not really
Like this
set in
answer,
reality as I
yeah,
see it.
yeah. I'm not into it either. So
Try
next,
try try Antarctica first.
okay. The next ones are just simple based or cringe. Dune, based or cringe.
Goon?
Dune,
As
the
in Oh,
novel
Dune,
book.
Dune. Oh,
Yeah,
Dune. Yes, Dune is very based.
very based. Good. Mormons, based or cringe.
Based.
Eric Weinstein, based or cringe.
I'm gonna decline to answer that.
And yeah, I think that was a quick fire round. I really like it.
All right.
And yeah, I mean the last question before the question where I ask you to recommend us a book. You've already recommended several, but maybe you have one that's juicy, and maybe if you've held it back. Is do you have what's your best white pill? Is there like some hopeful narrative that we can claw up onto to you know see us through
I
this?
think I think I think I think the most hopeful narrative that I have is essentially the weakening of political commitment in the 21st century, and the sort of increasing resemblance of the citizens of that century to the sort of normal people of all times who are completely depoliticized has pros as well as cons. Its cons are obviously you're looking for the energy, of some kind of resistance, right? As these incredible atrocities are being perpetrated on the citizens. I was reading the other day that can't trust this statistic completely, but of they're like, yeah, of new jobs created in the last year, like two-thirds are going to non-citizens. I mean, it's just like that would have driven the Americans of 100 years ago just like completely bananas, right?
Yeah.
And the completely bananas, and so you sort of lack this idea of collective self-interest is even considered contemptible. And so the thing is, when you're imagining sort of conditioning your regime change on kind of a change in collective self-interest like this, or an aggregation of collective self-interest into kind of force, and you realize, wow, this force is much much weaker than it used to be, then you're like, you're really disappointed. And you forget that the force that is holding the regime in place is made up of the same material. And just as, the commitment to your sort of side is becoming weaker, so is the commitment to their side. People, people's faith in their institutions is like headed, no, it's not a rock bottom. Oh, it's got quite a ways to go. But is it going up? No, it's not going up. My
No.
God, and so the thing is that there's this famous physics analogy of the irresistible force and the immovable object, and in many ways you're looking at the negligible force against the insubstantial object, which is still an interesting conflict. It's just a conflict that is happening on a very different scale than the one you're thinking of. It's like, my favorite part of which of course was not shown in those terrible movies of the Lord of the Rings, is of course the scouring of the Shire, in which in this marvelous political allegory, in which Tolkien denies is a political allegory, he basically has a sort of own vision of political restoration as a somewhat violent thing, but very, very happy, and on just this tremendously smaller and more local scale than this great struggle against evil. They're just like, no, we're just not going to have any more of you evil fucks. Right? Peter Jackson just can't film that because it would be unacceptable. And so in a way you're looking at a regime that is very, very heavy, but is not bolted to its foundations in a way that sort of anyone expects. And so there are a lot of things that can basically knock. Humpty Dumpty is not attached to the wall. And just as your ability to push on Humpty Dumpty is rusting away, so are the things that attaches Humpty Dumpty to the wall. And as soon as you can get to a situation where you can like, okay, we are going to push Humpty Dumpty over, and you're just like, number one, is Humpty Dumpty made of rubber or is he made of clay? If you push him over, is he going to bounce back up and go standing back on the wall, give you a smile, and then order all the king's men to like cut you to pieces? Or is he going to lie there in a pile of clay on the ground? And you look at this Humpty Dumpty and you're like, no one could create these institutions if they didn't exist. They wouldn't assemble them. You can't even imagine it, right? People don't have the mindset for institution building in that sense. And so one thing that people miss is they think of all sort of this leftist energy, which is all sort of drawn from the power that leftism has. And they're like, wow, how will the next regime deal with this? Which is sort of like asking, how will the Federal Republic of Germany deal with the Nazi werewolves? Well, really didn't have a werewolf problem at all, as it turns out, right? And that's because these heavily indoctrinated people, who are much more, well, I think their engagement, their political engagement with Nazism was much lower in 45 than in 33. It was probably much lower in 38 than in 33. But it was still high by modern standards, and they're just like, there's just absolutely no use in this bullshit. And furthermore, realizing that there is absolutely no use in this bullshit brings it home in just like a devastating clarity what parts of it were always bullshit. And the thing is that when you see this thing in a pile of clay on the ground covered by this just like ridiculous race babble, you're just like, one of my problems as a parent, speaking of teaching my kids to hide their power level is, I don't know if you watch any English Premier League, but my son is kind of a Chad and a soccer player. And so we watch a lot of English Premier League, and he's a Chelsea fan. And and what they've done in the English Premier League since this summer, besides all the weird ass COVID shit, is they say a prayer before every game, and it's a prayer against racism. And what they do is they vary the wording of it every time. They never say it the same way twice, so that it doesn't become rote. They're like, a very important message, and it's just so, when you realize that that's what they're doing, it's so weird and so creepy and so Orwellian that, of course, any 10-year-old is just going to find this hilarious, right? And if he's not indoctrinated with kind of deep reverence for the faith. And so you just have this this machine which is just disenchanting people in this like cynical way. It's like, there was this Barry Weiss story about, kids at exclusive prep schools in LA going full double triple woke squared, right? And what some of the parents were complaining about, this wasn't in the story but this was in some commentary I saw on it. They're like, the parents are like, yeah, this school is turning into an Alex P. Keaton factory. It's making our kids into Republicans, right? And so, the thing is, that's a somewhat natural process, right? And that's a process, that's the kind of process of decay that's very, very difficult for a system like this to counter. And that's not, that's sort of that's the way these things fall, where basically everybody realizes that nobody believes in the socialist miracle anymore, and even the elites are just fucking sick of it. And that's when Humpty Dumpty can just fall off the damn wall.
Yeah.
And you want something better than a pile of clay. You want something else. Something has to sit on that wall. And it's not going to be smart contracts. But um, the that's the situation that you're in, basically. Good answer. Solid answer.
Yeah,
All right.
absolutely solid answer, and very, very heartening. It reminds me of this book, the "Nothing to Envy" about lives in North Korea by Barbara Demick. It's just kind of
I don't know.
stories from people who managed to escape North Korea. And there was this the story when the great leader died. I think Kim Il Sung. Students in the courtyard were supposed to all start wailing and having all these fits. And then one of the students noticed that one of his colleagues was wetting his handkerchief and making his face wet so
Wow.
that
Yeah.
so that
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
looked like he was crying. And that was that was kind of like a totalitarian red pill moment, because they were like, aha, okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Everyone's doing this.
Nobody notices how many people are faking it, and the more the more that sense of weirdness grows, basically the sort of more the feeling of like how refreshing it is when it breaks, and so the more completely it can break, essentially. And you're still, in a lot of ways, when you compare our timeline to the world of Eastern Europe, in a lot of ways you're still more in the 50s than in the 70s and 80s. There's still a lot of true believers out there, and the true believers, one of the most important things to do is kind of just to not exacerbate the true believers. Don't give them a reason, don't give them any hope, don't give them any struggle, don't give them anything to latch onto.
Yeah,
Just let them.
should we expect that things just happen a bit faster, just because of the how information travels, and you have these red
Yes,
pill
I
moments.
think we should. Like, and shutting those things down is really hard. And there is definitely a Zoomer gamer culture of just corrosive, utter nihilistic cynicism, which I think is really beautiful and sweet. And the and that generation, coming up with that kind of post millennial nihilism, which is just like, what it's the default belief system of living in a world that you just obviously cannot take seriously. Your fucking Premier League with their prayers against racism or
Yeah,
whatever.
Gen
you
X on
know,
steroids. That's
Gen
Gen
X on
Z.
steroids, and it's like I make a joke of it, with my son. I'm like, oh wow, there's another black player on your team. Now you're really fighting back against racism. And and like the idea that this is anything could ever be a real thing or refer to anything real in the real world is so remote to him. It's so like, it just has this, like the thing is that when communist propaganda in like 1925 talks about the workers and the peasants, like there's this intense reality to it. And 1975, okay, yeah, they're still workers and peasants, but it's like, do they really think of themselves? And that, like, the energy is gone, and you're seeing that these constructs basically don't change. They, like the propaganda never changes. You're still like white supremacy as actually something that called itself that was like literally been dead for 60 years, right? And like how much more of like there are no actual witches can you get, right? And so it becomes this abstraction, in which faith is demanded. And of course, you can demand faith and abstractions from humans, but it becomes increasingly flimsy, and it exists in this culture of just pervasive, corrosive irony, right? And everyone knows how to be ironic now. It's not something restricted to the cosmopolitan elites. It's universal. Like, the spirit of basically Jewish mockery is everywhere. And that's a very corrosive spirit,
Good
and
job.
everyone knows how to do that now. And so, everyone could be Voltaire. And so it just, like, as soon as it's sort of, the moment it becomes permissible to laugh at this stuff, it will become the laughing stock of the ages. And that's basically, it's working itself into that position. And as Napoleon said, I'd never interfere with your enemy when he's making a mistake. And it's a mistake that it's making because it's not centralized. It's a mistake. It's this kind of autonomous drive that it has, which is the same drive that makes it kind of so tyrannical and evil, which eventually turns into a drive where it's driving itself really toward its own destruction. I mean, what central, like, party official would be like, okay, now it's time to go after Dr. Seuss. Now, we will show the population a lesson by taking on Dr. Seuss. I mean, it's this, like, obvious own goal, right?
Yeah.
And yet it can't be prevented from kicking itself into the goal. So,
Yeah, yeah.
that's my white pill for today.
That's a very good white pill. I mean, it's going to be the status games of the true believers that really do it in, because that's where all this
Yeah,
acceleration comes from. It's just like
sure.
blue-haired weirdos trying to score points, and
Yeah,
luckily,
and those things basically were the freshness of those things, sort of decreases over time. And so, the Trump period was a very dark period because it basically let all these, like, wine ants pretend that they were actually members of the French resistance. Like, okay, Comrade Julie, where should we plant the bomb on the train tracks, right? And you whack the Gestapo guy over the head with your frying pan, and we'll cut up the body together, right? And it was very romantic. It was very it was like, in this simple way that too many women are prone to, it really, like, it sold them, and it was a good sale. And when you don't have that, like, suddenly you're all dressed up with nowhere to go. Like, it's like the emotional, like, letdown is enormous. And I can't see what else is going to really generate that on
yeah,
on
the
an
Boogaloo Boys,
ongoing.
I hear,
The
they're very
Boogaloo Boys are here with their
dangerous.
Hawaiian shirts and their secret Boogaloo leader.
Yeah, all five
I
of
hear they
them.
have ranks. I hear that they have ranks like the KKK, but taken from Hawaiian legends.
Grand Wizard of the
Sorry,
Boogaloo.
yeah, sorry, I'm making, dear FBI, I'm making all this stuff up as I go along, right? The it's just, it's sort of grim and depressing, and the kind of grimmest, most depressing aspects of it just roll on, and it gets really hard to excite. I mean, it's like, imagine, like, you know kids these days, they're 6 or 7 or whatever, they go to an elementary school, and they're given this propaganda that was just, like, mind-blowingly exciting to their grandmother, right? And just, like, changed their grandmother's life, like, just revealed a new world to her, right? And they're given this stuff as if it was going to be as exciting as it to them as it was to grandma 60 years ago. And it's just not. And moreover, they recognize it as something their grandmother is into, and they're just like, yeah, okay, grandma shit, time for more grandma shit, right? And that creates, as long as, when there was a traditional world for those kids to push back against, that still created energy, but that source of energy is just gone, right? And that's really the danger in kind of raising kids kind of between two worlds, is that if you give them something to push back against and to basically leverage, if they're naturally smart and rebellious, as many children sadly are, the dumber ones are just easier, they'll push back against, and any sorts of leverage they'll find is something that they'll use. And if there's no source of that, there's no source of energy, then you basically don't have any there's sort of no positive advantage associated with these dumb ideas, and people look at them and they're like, "Oh, that's dumb. Why would I think that?" Right? And that's a much healthier state of mind. So that's my kind of jujitsu method. My woke, my post woke. A friend of mine keeps telling me to say post woke rather than anti woke, which I think is much better. That's my method.
Yeah, I
So
like this method, and interestingly, and you've come to the same conclusion as my husband because he was just saying, yeah, you're not going to lock our children in a bunker. You're just going
yeah,
to
no,
create
no,
total rebels. They're going to be transgender at 8 if you if you
yeah,
do that.
yeah.
So
Yeah, but
yeah,
if they're sent to school and they basically, receive all of this shit, and basically as a parent, the way I do it is just, it's sort of difficult, as especially when it becomes your profession, but I basically just pretend not to be interested in like politics at all. I'm just like, I don't, whenever the subject would come up, I would just be completely neutral, and I would be like, "Oh yeah, how about those Redskins?" And that's like, that teaches kids, again, when you don't have that emotional energy associated with the subject, then this pablum is just much more easily recognizable as what it is, and they just vomit it up, basically. And that's I'm sure it won't work for every kid, but
yeah. We'll just have to see what type of what this one's made of. So we'll see how he
all right,
reacts
all
to
right, all right. A boy, I take it, or
Yeah, yeah,
you're not?
it's a
Yeah,
boy. For firstborn son,
congratulations.
everyone's really happy about
Yeah, yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah. That's what it should be. All right, are we done here? Are we?
Yeah, yeah, we are. I just want to get your last recommendation of a subversive thinker. I mean, you've given
A
tons.
recommendation of a subversive thinker. What century do you want a century?
I want you to be like
Uh,
the subversive sommelier. Whoever whoever you
yeah,
think
yeah,
is
yeah.
good.
Okay, okay. I think that people really haven't read enough George Fitzhugh. George Fitzhugh is, I always recommend Carlyle. He's a contemporary of Carlyle, but he's an American. He's a Southerner, and he's the sort of core theorist of what Louis Hartz called the reactionary Enlightenment. Louis Hartz, writing as a liberal back in the 50s, called the reactionary Enlightenment of the 19th century. And he's essentially, you know, some people will basically take Fitzhugh's ideology as that of the Old South, which is by no means the case. The Old South really saw themselves as the heirs of the Glorious Revolution. It was people like Fitzhugh who were like, no, actually, we're undoing the whole thing here. That's what we should be doing. That's not what they actually were doing. And Fitzhugh is also a wonderful writer. He's really, he's gonna like remind you of like a pro-slavery Hunter S. Thompson, and
My kind of
and
guy.
and so, the thing is, you've never really, nobody's ever really sort of been exposed to a kind of writer of this, and his his, as a philosopher, he's really much deeper than Hunter S. Thompson, but as a writer, he has a kind of similar sense of fun in some ways, in a 19th century sense. And whether or not you agree with Fitzhugh or what you agree with Fitzhugh on, you'll basically find, you're like, wow, I know I've never read anything like this, and that's, like like that's an experience that shouldn't be missed. So
Awesome.
yeah, okay, let's and then if you're interested in Fitzhugh, you could follow up with Richard Weaver's The Southern Tradition at Bay, which is written in the 1930s, and is kind of a history of that stuff. And then there's actually a modern work. I think I may have it here. I can't find it. No, it's in a different bookcase. There's a modern. I'm unfortunately forgetting the name of, but there's actually a survey of the old Southern tradition. You'll find it quickly if you Google for it, by a modern historian that's actually quite good. So you got to let the devil have his due. But yeah, if that world, and for a woman, actually, I had my daughter recommend, all 12 of you out there, possibly two, or maybe just one. I had my daughter read, actually, Mary Chestnut's diary. She was a Southern lady, very literate and witty as well, who kept a diary during the war, and that's a fun perspective to be exposed to.
Oh, excellent.
So
Excellent. And
Excellent.
yeah, before I let you go, tell us about the Substack or any other projects you're working on that you want people to know of.
Well, my Substack is graymirror.substack.com. And I'm a satisfied customer of Substack. We'll see how long that lasts. But I've actually like, I have a reasonable level of faith in that company. And they're definitely, it's not like Blogger, where like it's sort of this accident of their business. Their business is essentially creating a new discourse, and I think they know that. And that they want that discourse to be as wide as possible, and it's really fucking with people's heads, which is great. um and yeah, so basically, what you get if you subscribe to Gray Mirror is, essentially what I'm doing is when I have sort of new material or new ideas, I generally paywall those. And when I'm kind of restating ideas I've stated in the past, it's sort of more likely to be free walled. The end result is basically a book. You froze there for a second. Is basically a book which is, kind of intended to be the a little more of an operating manual for what comes next. So I think it'll be a fun book, and we'll see. We'll see if anyone buys it or if anyone will let me sell it.